Good evening, good morning, YouTube, wherever you're at. So I thought I'd make a quick video. This one shouldn't take very long, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about why I love historical fiction. I love nonfiction too. I read a lot of nonfiction, but I tend to read more historical fiction than nonfiction, and why I enjoy it so much. So I'll go ahead and put a few of these up. This was a big one for me right here, Wolf Hall. I love this series. This is a fantastic series if you've never read this. Anyway, before I read this series, though, I really didn't know that much about Henry VIII. Not as much as I thought I did, at least. I knew some stuff about Henry VIII, and that's kind of how I do it. I'll read a series like this, and typically the way I do it, the first thing I'll do is I go to the Wikipedia article. I'm usually not too intimidated by any historical fiction series, even if it's a subject matter I don't know that well, and that's because I'm willing to learn about it. You don't need to do if it's a good writer, you don't typically need to do a whole bunch of research, but some writers will expect you to know some stuff already, and either way really works. And most of the time, like I said, when I first read this Wolf Hall right here, I didn't know that much about Henry VIII, and I still or Thomas Cromwell, and I still enjoyed this a lot. But for me, a lot of the fun is doing the research, right? And going and doing and looking this stuff up and learning about it and learning the history of this stuff. If you didn't know if you didn't know anything about Henry VIII, you wouldn't know that the War of the Roses took place right before this. A lot of people in the modern age right now, or at least in my generation, know War of the Roses from Game of Thrones. It's become a pretty well-known, historical event now in the United States, which probably prior to Game of Thrones it wasn't as well known. Anyway, so when I first read this, I didn't know that much about Henry VIII. But now I know a whole bunch, right? And then, of course, Bloody Mary came after that, and then Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. So there's a lot of historical stuff I learned all sprang from this. It started right here, began right here. And this isn't the first time, that I learned a lot about an historical event. I didn't grab it off my shelf, but also when I first started reading the Accursed King series, and I came to the Accursed King series by Maurice Durand through Game of Thrones. And I didn't know that much about the 100 Years' War before I read that. But while I read that series, again, the first thing I did was I went and looked up the Wikipedia article, and then I read the series. But even like this with Wolf Hall, I ended up reading an entire Thomas Cromwell biography because of this, and that I really enjoyed. And I like history, and I read a lot of nonfiction, but biographies aren't necessarily my favorite way of reading about history. I like kind of narrative histories that are more, that are less like a specific person and more like a subject matter. Like recently I read Dan Jones's War of the Roses. What's another one? Well, really a bunch of the Dan Jones books. But I'm about to read Rit Atkinson's The British Are Coming, which is more like a narrative history of the American Revolution, which is for my own personal research for a project I'm doing, which involves a historical fiction novel I want to write. I don't really mind saying I don't care. I don't think it's some super original idea. It's going to be sort of like the Sharp series, but with the American Revolution. And I'm going to, create a character, and we're going to follow that character through the American Revolution. So that's part of my own personal research, even though there were other books I want to read before that. Anyhow, but that's part of the reason why I love historical fiction. I'm going to hold up right here. I'll tell a little story right here about this. This is Bernard Cornwell. This is my favorite author. Bernard Cornwell is always going to be my favorite author. It's never going to change, and that has to do. And there's nostalgia reasons for that, and I'm not afraid to admit that. But that has to do with me being a young adult, having to go back to my grandma's house, kind of with my tail tucked between my legs and moving back there, and this being an escape for me and bringing me great joy, right? So when I first discovered this series, I had been reading westerns. I'd read a whole bunch of westerns, so. And by this time, at this point in time, in my life, William Johnson was my favorite author, but I read a bunch of Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour. So I go to the library and I pulled the old, this was in the early days of the internet. I mean, the internet was around, but it wasn't quite what it is. It definitely wasn't what it is now. So anyway, I go to the library and I talk to somebody there. I say, I said, my friend really likes westerns, because I was a little embarrassed by it. It was reading's already an unusual hobby, so on top of that I was reading westerns, which were like not in style at all. I don't know, they still make those William Johnson books, though they're co-written by J.A. Johnson. I don't even think they're related. But anyway, I was like, my friend really likes Westerns, and what else, and, if he wanted to read something similar to that, what could he read? And I wish I would have got to know this person a little bit better. So I talked to him a few times at the library, and he went over and he said, "What else have you read recently?" And at that time, I was just starting to get interested in history. I had just watched some Napoleonic era documentary, and I ended up reading a Napoleon biography, and it was Napoleon: A Life by Andrew Roberts. And I told him that, and he said, "Oh, I got just the thing for you." And he went and he pulled this, not this exact novel, but a Bernard Cornwell Sharpe series novel off the shelf. And I was like, yeah, that looks good. I'm going to try that. And I think it was the first one in publication order, which is Sharpe's Eagles, which I actually just reread, and it was fantastic. I loved it. Again, these are not literary masterpieces. They are fun action adventure. And again, when I first read this, and like I said, I deeply enjoyed this. I was a young man. I was a very young man at the time. And I loved getting to the back and reading the historical notes and going and looking the stuff up. Like I said, it was still early in the internet, but you could find a lot of it, even back then, this was in like 2011 or something. You could find all this stuff. And 2011 is still the days of MySpace, right? So anyway, I was a pretty young man at the time, barely an adult. So I go and I read this, and I read the historical notes, and like I said, I just read this Napoleon biography, or maybe I was doing both at the same time. But that's what it led me to learning a whole bunch about the Napoleonic era, right? And then I started connecting the dots. I was like, well, this Napoleonic era, this is in, the early 1800s, 1804 to, Napoleon started in 1793, but it goes up up until 1850 or 1814, 1815, right when Waterloo happens. Anyway, I'm like, this is not that far after the American Revolution. 1776. That's when we did, the United States declared its independence. So anyway, I started making those connections and realizing that, those periods in history were somewhat close together. And then, I started learning about the 7 Years' War and all the other stuff that's in between, and, the British wars in India and all that stuff. And it just became a fascinating period to learn about, and I'm just so glad that I did it, and I learned so much from it. And it's not and that wouldn't be the last time I would do that. Eventually I'd pick up, and I went and pulled this one off of the shelf, but I'd pick this up too. And I read this almost, well, no, because it'd been out for some years at the time. Like I said, I started reading Bernard Cornwell right around 2011. Because around this time, I would end up reading Game of Thrones probably about a year after this. Right after it was after the first season of Game of Thrones I read it. And Game of Thrones is a big reason I got into history too, but I would pick this up, and this was not on TV yet. And this is The Last Kingdom by Bernard Cornwell. And this is when I would start learning a whole bunch about the Viking Age. And then I would start learning I started learning a whole lot more about English history and history of the UK. And that's when I started making the connection of, what's Wales? What is Wales? Right? But at that time, I didn't know much about, English history and stuff. And, to me, Wales was just a country. I didn't realize it was a whole other culture with a whole other language. But not long after I started reading this stuff, I'd pick up Shogun by James Clavell. Shogun is one of the reasons I got into language learning. I thought if this guy could learn Japanese when he was in his mid-30s, I could learn Spanish or French at, 19. And I would. Now, I'm not incredibly fluent at either of those languages, but I can speak them, and I can read in those languages. If I could go back in time, I might do things a little bit differently. I might learn an Eastern language like Persian or Russian or something, except with a different alphabet, but that's okay. That's neither here nor there, and I can still always do those things. It's not out of the question. But, that's the whole point, though, is like this historical fiction, and seeing these historical adventures just really, inspired me, and I'm just really happy for it. And I still do it to this day. And like I said, I'm rereading the Sharpe series. I picked up a bunch of reference materials that continue reading the series, a bunch of Napoleonic era maps. And I just really like doing that. So when I get to these historical events, because each of the Sharpe novels are based on some battle from the Napoleonic era. And a lot of historical fiction books are like this. It's not just Bernard Cornwell does this. They all do it. But I can go and I can look up these maps, and I can, kind of trace what was going on and seeing battlefield formations, and I just really enjoy that stuff. So, that's just my personal history and why I think historical fiction is so great. And I understand a lot of the booktube community right now is into literary fiction or fantasy. I don't see many people talk about historical fiction or nonfiction, so I hope that I can bring something a little bit different. Obviously I probably look a little bit different than most people on BookTube. So hopefully people, see, maybe some younger people will see someone kind of near their age group, really into history and nonfiction and historical fiction, might give it a try. Again, I'd also recommend Wilbur Smith. Wilbur Smith writes historical fiction books set in Africa. He also does some books that were contemporary at the time that he wrote them. I think I don't see many people talk about Wilbur Smith, and he'll probably be forgotten, but that's one of the mission statements of my channel is I want Wilbur Smith and Bernard Cornwell to be remembered. Bernard Cornwell's got a pretty good shot at being remembered for a while. He had 3 TV shows made out of his books, which is incredibly rare. Most authors are lucky to get 1 series made out of their books or movie. He had 3. And 2 of the 3 were big hits, especially the Sharpe series, but really The Last Kingdom was a mega hit too. But there's a whole YouTube community that's into the Sharpe TV series. Some British blokes, which is one of the reasons I was already planning on reading Bernard Cornwell, and Richard Sharpe is my favorite fictional character of all time. So I've decided, and I'm going to reread the whole series, and I can go watch all these YouTube videos I found on Sharpe TV series. I've only seen the first episode, so I'm going to rewatch the whole show. But that's another thing I love about historical fiction. It just leads you to learning more about history. Obviously you can get into Rome. Rome is endless. If you've never read anything about Rome or don't know any Roman history, it's fascinating for one. But 2, it is just a ton of material and things that you can read and fascinating subjects. And I'm not just talking about Julius Caesar. It goes way beyond that. Learn about Sulla. You want to learn about an interesting guy or Hannibal? Learn about Hannibal. Sulla's a good one. Vespasian. There are tons of stuff to learn about the Roman Empire. And it doesn't just end at books. There's podcasts. Look up the Mike Duncan podcast. Mike Duncan writes some books too. Read Storm Before the Storm. That's a good nonfiction book about Sulla and I want to say is it Marius? It's Sulla and Marius that fight. Yes, I believe it's Marius and Sulla. That they have a little. Sulla was like Caesar before Caesar. So anyway, but I'm not going to get into all that. If you're watching, there's a good chance you know a bit of Roman history. So anyway, that's all for today, YouTube. Good day or good night, wherever you're at.